Okay, hello everybody for Facebook Live today in the sunshine again, which is great. I'm Roger Levitt and I'm a business and property mediator and recently retired full-time commercial property solicitor. And I'm now just concentrating on mediation, which is great because I love doing it. So let me tell you what we're going to be talking about today. We are going to be talking about neighbour disputes in all their shapes and sizes. Who would have neighbours, eh? Well, most of us do, whether it's left or right, up and down, but how we get on with our neighbours often forms a fundamental part of our lives. We leave our house or our flat in the morning and we come back in the evening. Are we happy when we return? Are we happy when we leave? Sometimes that sadly can depend upon whether we have to walk past a neighbour or go down some steps past their flat, which brings in bad feelings because we're in dispute with them about something. So for some people it can be a nightmare, and I'm sure that many of you have seen horrible stories of what some neighbours have done to their neighbours in the press and on the radio. And in some cases, it's about something which, as a neutral onlooker, we think is terribly, terribly trivial. The trouble is that when people get into this situation, often the only way of finding a level of peace with each other is for one to drive the other out and move, which is far from ideal, but in some cases that's just the only way around it. And of course, if that happens, then you have a dispute which, if and when you come to sell, you would need to disclose to a prospective buyer, and that brings up all sorts of further complications which you would obviously prefer to avoid. So the purpose of this session ideally is to make this as interactive as possible. Now, it would be great if you're able to share some good or bad experience that you've had with a neighbour, which is something that we can then discuss in the group. Also, please send me any questions that you might have, because it's very helpful. I've got loads of personal stories and experience to tell. It would be great to hear some of yours, and whether they're good or bad, we can talk about them during this half-an-hour session. So, what types of neighbour disputes am I aware of from my dealings with this as a business and property mediator? Well, the first, probably the most obvious one, is the boundary dispute. This is where there's a dispute over part of the land that separates one neighbour from another. You probably wouldn't be amazed to hear that I've been called in to mediate on disputes where we're actually only talking about a slither of land, but for some reason it's got ridiculous levels of importance attached to it. Now, the way that the land registry boundary plans work, they have a certain level of tolerance of accuracy anyway. So even if it's possible to establish exactly according to the land registry boundary plan where the boundary is, you would be amazed at how many people produce evidence to show that either the land registry got it wrong somehow, or that the situation on the ground is very different and therefore it should be changed in their favour. Now, Other types of disputes revolve around access ways. Whenever people share an access way, they have an amazing ability to, in some cases, to argue over how it's used, when it's used, how wide it is, how narrow it is, what the title deeds say about how you can actually use the access way up to a certain point or beyond a certain point. It's quite astonishing, because everything that we as humans can agree about, of course, we can also disagree about. And when you add into the mix the high emotion that is shown, the sometimes ego that is being affected, the pride, and the principle, you get a very complicated mix that sometimes is very, very difficult to unwind. Looking at it from a neutral point of view, often it seems clear, but to the parties themselves, it matters too much to back down. So we have disputes over title. We have disputes over rights of light. We have disputes over noise, which is very common. One party's reasonable activity is another party's nuisance, and you can have situations where it might only be children behaving normally as children do, that's causing a tremendous discomfort and nuisance and inconvenience to somebody living underneath, who might be, let's say, elderly and can't stand the noise in any way, and then one has to look at the situation and see how it's possible to meet both parties' needs in a way that they can live with it without necessarily driving the other party out. The one common factor in all of these types of dispute, for whatever reason, both parties are not approaching it with a reasonable manner and a reasonable view as to how this could be settled, because there is always a solution. There's always a way around a problem if you are prepared to stand back and look at the situation as objectively as you can. So what I'd like to do now, sorry, someone has messaged a question anonymously for me. It says, if you have pests, i.e. mice, rats, and they're coming in from next door, but neighbours won't spend money to block the holes, where do you stand? Well, I'd probably suggest that we might talk about that afterwards, but in principle, if it's something like that, then it's something which the local authority would need to be involved in, because clearly there's potentially a major health hazard there, and that's not necessarily something that the party from whom the mice and the rats are coming from has any direct control, but it does seem to me that that obviously something that's in the interest of the party where the mice and the rats are coming from as well, to have the local authority pest control people to come in and have a look at it, to get rid of them. I have to say, actually, that it's not a topic that I've had to mediate over, because it's usually something that would be dealt with by the local authority, and a little bit surprising that the party where the rats and mice have come from hasn't already dealt with that. So Yeah, so going back to where I was with the ways in which disputes could be minimised or even prevented altogether. Amazingly simple, but very effective, is to actually talk to your neighbour. Now, that might seem like stating the glaringly obvious. We're all told regularly by phone companies that it's good to talk, but I would say that 99.99% of the neighbour disputes that I've dealt with are as a result of either miscommunication or no communication at all, because people assume that the other party will know exactly what they're worried about, and they really ought to be psychic and do something about it. Now, if it's something as obvious as the mice and the rats, you would think that should almost go without saying, but nevertheless, unless it is approached, unless you say something, then it's possible that the person who owns the property from where the mice and rats are coming might not know about the problem. And so I see many position statements in mediation where people are explaining in great detail something that they assumed the other party knew all about, but in fact they didn't. And what usually happens in those situations is that the emotion escalates, because the more you think that somebody should have anticipated what the problem is, the less they have. And so in absolute frustration, the party who is aggrieved will then go to a solicitor, send a letter before claim, and escalate the situation when it might not have been necessary for it to be escalated. So in this situation, talk is cheap. We can and often do resolve situations just by talking, just by interacting, and that could even be the end of the matter. It should be if it's received in the way that the communication is made, and if the communication is made constructively and in an unemotive way, then usually you get a good response from the other side. Now, if for whatever reason speaking direct is a problem, then why not write an informal note and make it as friendly as possible? But it can be a note to form the basis of the discussion, to say, look, this is happening. You may or may not be aware of it. Can we please have a conversation about it, because we have a problem with it because of A, B, and C. Again, that would be pretty straightforward, and it would seem to be fairly obvious. But again, for the reasons that I've already mentioned, it's amazing how many people don't do that. So then if for any reason those two options haven't worked, or they've worked up to a point where you've highlighted what the problems are, but you can't resolve them between you, then the next step would be to involve a neutral third party, a mediator. Now, there are two ways of approaching this. Either you go to a mediator direct and bring in solicitors, or you go to a solicitor who would then bring in the mediator. As far as I'm concerned, it really doesn't matter which way round it's done, because the important thing is that we, as mediators, work together with solicitors and the parties in dispute to help them find a solution that they can live with, which will not be perfect. It will not be one wins and the other loses, because that's what happens when you go to court. But the advantage of bringing in a mediator is that you get somebody who is entirely neutral, who can look at it with the parties and the solicitors, taking out as far as possible the emotion, the ego, the pride, and the principle. And when you strip all that away, you get a much simpler looking problem. Sometimes it's not always possible for the parties to see it that way to start with, but when you hear the neutral language, the non-adversarial language that the mediator will speak, it should set the tone for a very different form of discussion. And it's not about point scoring, it's not about winning, it's not about winning and losing. It's about helping you to find a way of, in this case, living alongside each other or above and below each other, without going to court, which will save you time, stress, cost, and the inevitable uncertainty which follows if you do go to court. And then the aim of this approaching it this way is so that you can go back to living your lives next to each other or above and below each other, without the acrimony and without the fear of the dispute continuing. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be best buddies, but you don't have to be. You can be good neighbours without being best friends. So I'm just going to have another quick look to see whether we have any more questions. I've got okay, so Jenny Woods has raised a question about fast growing trees in a narrow Victorian house in the back garden. Now 2 trees on the boundary over 30 foot high. If you're able to explain a little bit more about what the how that problem has grown, and what you've done, if anything, to try and resolve it, then I'm happy to talk about that further. Trees on boundaries are generally quite a frequent issue. Sometimes it's because it's just a problem of the tree creating a light blockage. Other times it's because the tree has grown very quickly and hadn't been anticipated to grow into somebody else's space. But generally there are commonly simple problems that can be created, and solutions that can be put forward in order to try and help these situations. It goes back to a point I made earlier about how you approach this with your neighbour, because for every problem there is a solution. If you work on it together, then it makes the solution so much easier. Two minds working on a problem to bring about a acceptable and creative solution for each party is is so much better than working against each other, because it may well be that the solution lies in an answer that works for both of you, and it can be obvious sometimes, but if you're fighting each other, it may not work just because you're fighting. So I was going to give a couple of examples. I've got loads and loads of examples, but I just thought I'd pick on two for the time being. So I was involved mediating a dispute between two neighbours who lived in adjoining houses, and I literally had to juggle between sitting on the fence, which was not terribly comfortable, and running down one long driveway from one house, and then running up the other long driveway to the other house, because the parties insisted on separate meetings because they wouldn't sit together. In this case, because they were in large houses and they were, I suppose, 200-300 meters away from each other, they didn't have to sit together, but they could have done. They could have gone in one or other of the houses, but they couldn't agree on which house it would be, even if they could agree to sit together, which sadly they couldn't. They could have gone to a local hotel, and then we could have sat in the same room, but they wouldn't do that either. So I ended up with lots of exercise, running up and down, actually late into the night as well, as I remember. And the dispute itself was over a slither of land on the joint boundary, and the use and the maintenance of a joint access way, which actually was shared by two other house owners. Now, to me, it just seemed so obvious, the boundary sliver point was just so immaterial. These were large houses with large gardens, but it was just a point of principle that one party believed that the other party was stealing their land or part of their land, and the accessway point also seemed very, very straightforward, because there was some flooding that was being caused from one of the properties to the other, because the accessway hadn't been properly maintained and repaired. Now, the actual cost of maintaining and repairing the accessway between the four families who use this accessway was not great in the scheme of the value of the houses, and the length of time that they'd been there as well, and hopefully the length of time that they would continue to be there. And of course, it was also going to prevent this from being a problem for owners in the future. But it still took a long time till we actually did get a settlement. And the reason was that they were awkward and cantankerous and objectionable in the way that they approached the exercise. If they had been able to be sensible about it from the start, and if they'd been able to sit in the same room, I think we would have got a solution much, much, much earlier in the day. Okay, so the other example that I was going to talk about is a couple of houses in an area of South London where different sorts of considerations a couple of families who used to be best friends, they fell out sadly when they decided to buy these two plots of land together. One already had a house on it, the other was a plot of land for development. The plot of land for development was expected to take 3 years to be built. That took 7, so caused a great deal of extra noise, extra inconvenience for the party who already had moved into the house that was existing, because they shared an access way. So the construction traffic was a great inconvenience, and as the inconvenience got greater and greater, so they became further apart in the way that they thought about how they should be dealing with this, and they became less and less friendly, to the point where they eventually weren't speaking at all. So they disagreed over everything that it would be possible to disagree with in relation to the works, the access way, the cost of the access way, the use of the access way, and the situation got worse and worse to the point where they fell out completely, and then the party who had spent the money, which was going to be shared 50-50 on the refurbishment of the accessway, eventually issued proceedings against the other party. So when I was brought in, we had a full day of mediation. This is after an initial site visit. We got a partial settlement at the end of the day, but they wanted to carry on because we still had a number of points that needed to be resolved. Over the course of the next year, we had 2 further meetings, lots of emails. Eventually, it did get settled, but an extraordinary amount of time and effort and grief, and sadly they don't speak, as far as I'm aware. They haven't gone back to being friends again. But the process worked, and it's a very good example of a situation where it takes as long as it takes, unfortunately, and in this case, it took a year. So, coming to the end of the 30 minutes, if anyone has any further questions, or they want to talk to me now or afterwards, please do so. I'm pleased to see that there have been some questions and interventions, so thank you very much for that. And by all means, have a listen to, and have a watch of the video later on in the day, and get in touch with me if you have anything to add. Okay, thank you very much. I'm now going to end the video.